The store manager slaps black woman in front of shoppers, unaware she's the billionaire that owns the store. Get your ghetto poor self out of my store before I call security on you. Marcus Thompson snarled at the black woman trying to return a handbag. His voice dripped with contempt as customers stared in shock. He had no idea he was speaking to Keisha Washington, the billionaire CEO, who owned every inch of the building he stood in. Before we continue with the story, make sure you subscribe, like, share and comment where you are watching from. Thank you. The burgundy leather bag felt heavier in Keisha Washington's hands than it should have, weighted not by its contents, but by the gravity of what she was about to discover. Standing in the employee parking lot behind Lux & Company's flagship store on Fifth Avenue, she drew a steadying breath that misted in the October morning air. The familiar scent of expensive perfume and fresh coffee drifted from the employee entrance, mixing with exhaust fumes and the distant hum of Manhattan waking up. At 52, Keisha had conquered boardrooms where men twice her size cowered at her presence. She had built a retail empire worth $3 billion from nothing but determination and a $20 bill her grandmother had pressed into her palm before she died. Yet today, dressed in a simple navy sweater from Target and jeans that had seen better days, she felt more vulnerable than she had in decades. The security camera above the back door blinked red, recording her every movement. How fitting, she thought grimly, that her own surveillance system would capture what might be the most important test of her career. She had reviewed the quarterly reports 3 times last night, each page painting a picture that kept her awake until dawn. Customer satisfaction scores were declining. Complaints about staff behavior were rising, and whispered accusations of discrimination had begun reaching the ears of board members who measured success only in profit margins. "You built this place to be different," she whispered to herself, fingering the worn strap of her grandmother's purse. The bag was older than her empire, its leather soft with age and memories. Grandma Rose had carried it to church every Sunday, to parent-teacher conferences, to the grocery store where she'd counted every penny twice. It had been her armor against a world that often treated black women as invisible at best, threatening at worst. Now it would be Keisha's disguise. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying the layout of her own store like a thief casing a target. She knew that Marcus Thompson would be working the customer service counter this morning, the man she had personally hired 2 years ago after he'd impressed her with passionate speeches about dignity and respect. She knew that the morning shift would be busy but not overwhelming, perfect for observing how her staff handled pressure. She knew that the security cameras would capture everything, creating an undeniable record of whatever was about to unfold. What she didn't know was whether the values she had built this company on, the dreams of her 17-year-old self, who had been followed and humiliated in stores just like this one, actually existed beyond the mission statement engraved in gold letters near the entrance. The damaged handbag in her hands told a story of deliberate sabotage. 2 weeks ago, using a fake identity and cash, she had purchased it from this very store. Then, in the privacy of her penthouse office, she had carefully torn the lining, creating a legitimate reason for return. The receipt was genuine, the complaint valid, the transaction legal. By every measure that mattered, she was a customer with a right to fair treatment. But rights, she had learned long ago, were often conditional on how much melanin lived in your skin. A delivery truck rumbled past, its engine drowning out the sound of her racing heartbeat. Through the store's back windows, she could see her employees preparing for another day, arranging displays and checking inventory systems that bore her fingerprints in every algorithm. These people worked for her, respected her, called her Ma'am and Ms. Washington with voices full of deference when she visited in her executive attire. Would they see her differently in discount clothes and worn shoes? Would the respect vanish when stripped of its obvious markers of power? The question that had driven her here, the one that made her stomach clench with dread, was simpler and more devastating. Had she built a company that truly valued human dignity, or had she simply created another beautiful facade that crumbled when tested by the harsh light of reality? Her phone buzzed with messages from her assistant, reminders of board meetings and conference calls that would shape the futures of thousands of employees. The irony wasn't lost on her that while she was preparing to test whether her company treated customers with basic humanity, she was simultaneously late for a meeting about expanding into 3 new markets. But some tests couldn't wait for convenient timing. Keisha slipped the phone back into her grandmother's purse and walked toward the main entrance, each step carrying her further from the safety of anonymity and closer to a truth she both needed and feared to discover. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and she found herself thinking of another morning, 35 years ago, when she had walked into a store much like this one with hope in her heart and $20 in her pocket, only to leave with tears on her cheeks and shame burning in her chest. Today, she had the power to ensure no one else would ever leave her stores feeling that way. If that is, her stores actually lived up to the promises she had made. The glass doors reflected her image as she approached, not the polished executive who graced magazine covers and commanded respect in every room she entered, but a middle-aged black woman in ordinary clothes carrying an old purse and a damaged handbag. She realized with a mixture of sadness and determination, exactly like the customers she had built this company to serve. The automatic doors whispered open, welcoming her into the empire she had created but might not recognize. What would happen when Keisha Washington walked into her own store as just another customer? Would the values she had spent decades building hold firm, or would she discover that all her success, all her careful planning, all her dreams of creating something better had been nothing more than expensive illusions? The marble floor clicked softly under her feet as she stepped inside, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear Marcus Thompson's voice greeting another customer with professional warmth. Soon it would be her turn. What do you think drives successful people to test their own companies in secret? Have you ever wondered what would happen if a CEO walked into their business unrecognized? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear whether you think Keisha will find what she's looking for, or something far more devastating. The first thing Keisha noticed as she stepped into Lux & Company was the scent, vanilla and bergamot, carefully calibrated by specialists to evoke feelings of comfort and luxury. She had spent months perfecting that fragrance blend, determined that every customer would feel welcome the moment they crossed the threshold. Now, breathing it in as an anonymous visitor, she wondered if the warmth extended beyond manufactured aromatics. The store hummed with purposeful energy. Sales associates moved between displays with practiced grace, their uniforms, charcoal gray with burgundy accents, chosen by Keisha herself, crisp and professional. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated merchandise arranged with museum-quality precision. Everything looked exactly as she had envisioned when she'd sketched the first designs in her cramped studio apartment 28 years ago. But appearances, Keisha had learned through bitter experience, could be masterful liars. She paused near the jewelry counter, watching her employees through new eyes. There was Jessica Liu at the cosmetics station, a young woman Keisha had personally mentored after Jessica's immigrant parents had scraped together tuition for business school. Jessica moved with quiet confidence, her gentle manner putting customers at ease as she demonstrated products with genuine enthusiasm rather than aggressive sales tactics. At the handbag display stood David Park, whose 3 children Keisha had met at the company holiday party. David had started as part-time seasonal help 5 years ago and worked his way up to department supervisor through sheer dedication. She watched him now, noting how he listened intently to an elderly customer's questions, his patience evident in every gesture. These were good people. People she had chosen carefully, trained personally, trusted with her vision of what retail could be when it prioritized humanity over quarterly profits. Yet the complaints kept coming. Whispered stories of customers feeling judged, followed, dismissed. Stories that made her stomach twist with recognition because she had lived them herself. Near the customer service counter, she spotted the man who would either validate or destroy everything she believed about her company. Marcus Thompson stood behind the marble counter like a general surveying his domain, his 6-foot frame commanding attention even in stillness. His resume had been flawless, 10 years of retail management, glowing references, an MBA from a respectable program. During the interview, he had spoken with genuine passion about creating inclusive spaces where every customer felt valued. "I've seen what happens when people are judged before they even speak," he had told her, his dark eyes intense with conviction. "My mother cleaned offices at night to put me through school. She taught me that dignity isn't determined by the size of someone's wallet." Keisha had hired him on the spot, convinced she had found someone who shared her deepest values. For 2 years, his performance reviews had been stellar. Customer feedback about his department remained largely positive. He seemed to embody everything she had hoped to cultivate in her leadership team. Yet something nagged at her, a collection of small incidents that hadn't quite risen to the level of formal complaints but formed a troubling pattern. A young black mother who mentioned feeling watched while shopping for her daughter's birthday gift. An elderly Hispanic woman who said she felt rushed during a return that should have been routine. A college student who described Marcus's attitude as cold when she asked about payment plans. None of it actionable, all of it familiar. From her position near the jewelry counter, Keisha could see Marcus greeting customers with professional warmth. His smile appeared genuine, his manner appropriately helpful. To a casual observer, he seemed like exactly the kind of employee any company would cherish. But Keisha had learned to read the subtle languages of bias, the way eyes assessed and categorized, the microscopic shifts in posture and tone that conveyed judgment faster than words. She studied the other morning staff, people whose livelihoods depended on her decisions and whose actions reflected her leadership. There was Angela Martinez, whose grandmother had worked as a seamstress in the garment district for 40 years. Angela had joined Lux and Company straight from community college, hungry for opportunity and determined to build something better for her own daughter. At the perfume counter, she recognized Robert Kim, a soft-spoken man whose gentle demeanor masked the fierce intelligence that had earned him a degree in chemistry before he'd chosen retail over research. Robert treated fragrance like poetry, helping customers discover scents that matched their personalities rather than simply pushing expensive options. These were her people, extensions of her vision, carriers of her values, the living embodiment of everything she had hoped to create when she'd walked away from her first corporate job and mortgaged her grandmother's house to open a single boutique in Brooklyn. But people, she knew with painful clarity, were complex creatures capable of surprising contradictions. The same person who showed genuine kindness to some customers might unconsciously judge others. The same employee who passionately defended company values in meetings might struggle to apply them when faced with unconscious biases they didn't even recognize in themselves. Keisha fingered the damaged handbag in her grandmother's old purse, feeling the weight of the test she was about to conduct. This wasn't just about Marcus Thompson or customer service protocols. It was about whether the company she had poured her soul into had actually absorbed the lessons of her own painful journey from powerlessness to influence. She thought of the girl she had been at 17, bright, hopeful, saving every dollar from her part-time job at a neighborhood diner to buy a dress for senior prom. She remembered walking into that upscale boutique downtown, her heart racing with excitement and carefully contained dreams. The dress she wanted hung in the window like a promise, elegant and sophisticated, the kind of dress that might transform a girl from the projects into someone who belonged in fancier spaces. But the moment she stepped inside, everything changed. The sales associate's smile had faltered, replaced by a careful politeness that felt like frost. Security guards had materialized with suspicious timing, following her movements with obvious intent. When she'd finally gathered the courage to ask about the dress, the price had been quoted with a tone that suggested she couldn't possibly afford it, followed by a pointed suggestion about more appropriate options in their clearance section. She had left without buying anything, her carefully saved money burning in her pocket like evidence of her own inadequacy. The humiliation had followed her home, through graduation, through her first job and her second. It had become fuel for her ambition, but also a wound that never quite healed. That 17-year-old girl lived inside her still, vulnerable and hoping despite all evidence that the world might be kinder than it appeared. Today, That girl would discover whether the woman she had become had succeeded in creating the safe space she had never found. The customer service counter beckoned like an altar where truth would be revealed. Marcus Thompson's voice carried across the store as he processed a return for a well-dressed woman who smiled and thanked him warmly. Professional. Courteous. Exactly what any customer should expect. But what would happen when Keisha Washington, stripped of her executive armor and reduced to her essential self, approached that same counter with a legitimate complaint and a reasonable request? What would happen when success met its own reflection in the mirror of authentic experience? She adjusted her grip on her grandmother's purse and began walking toward the customer service counter, each step carrying her closer to answers she both needed and feared to discover. The marble floor clicked softly under her worn sneakers, a rhythm that matched the accelerating beat of her heart. Behind the counter, Marcus Thompson looked up with professional attention, his practiced smile beginning to form as he prepared to greet his next customer. Neither of them yet realized they were about to participate in the most important transaction of both their careers. The 20-foot walk to the customer service counter felt like crossing a battlefield. Keisha's worn sneakers made soft sounds against the marble floor, each step echoing in her ears like gunshots. The damaged handbag in her grandmother's purse seemed to pulse with the weight of what was about to unfold. Not just a simple return, but a test that would reveal the true character of everything she had built. Marcus Thompson looked up as she approached, his professional smile activating like a well-oiled mechanism. At first glance, his expression held the same courteous attention he had shown the previous customer, a wealthy-looking woman who had left with a satisfied nod and warm thanks. But Keisha, trained by decades of reading micro-expressions in boardrooms where millions hung on subtle cues, caught something else. A microscopic shift in his posture, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes as he assessed her discount clothes and worn appearance. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of customer service training. "How can I help you today?" The words were correct, professional, exactly what any training manual would recommend. But something in his tone, a slight stiffness perhaps, or the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, made Keisha's stomach clench with familiar dread. She had heard that tone before, in 100 different stores over the years, the careful politeness that masked judgment and conveyed a message as clear as spoken words. "You don't belong here." "I'd like to return this handbag," Keisha said, her voice steady despite the tornado of emotions swirling in her chest. She reached into her grandmother's old purse and withdrew the damaged bag, placing it gently on the marble counter. "I bought it 2 weeks ago, but when I got home, I discovered the lining is torn." Marcus's eyes moved from her face to the bag, then back again, the assessment quick but thorough. She watched him catalog details, her clothing, her posture, the condition of her purse, the quality of the item being returned. It was like watching a computer process data, sorting and categorizing in seconds. "Do you have your receipt?" he asked, and there it was, the first real note of skepticism creeping into his professional facade. Not the gentle inquiry of someone expecting a straightforward transaction, but the careful probing of someone already doubting the legitimacy of her claim. Keisha produced the receipt from her purse, the paper crisp and legitimate, bearing all the proper codes and verification marks that proved her purchase. She placed it on the counter next to the handbag, watching Marcus's face as he examined both items. But instead of the quick verification she had witnessed with the previous customer, Marcus picked up the receipt and held it up to the light, studying it with theatrical suspicion that made several nearby shoppers pause and glance over. The action was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but obvious enough to signal doubt about its authenticity. "This receipt," Marcus began, his voice pitched just loud enough for other customers to hear. "It looks a bit questionable. We've been having issues with fraudulent returns lately." The words hit Keisha like physical blows. Not because they were shouted or obviously hostile, but because of their casual cruelty, the way they transformed a legitimate customer with a valid complaint into a suspected criminal without evidence or justification. Around them, other shoppers began to take notice, some pulling out phones with the instinctive response of a generation raised on viral videos. "I assure you the receipt is genuine," Keisha replied, her voice remaining calm despite the fire building in her chest. "I purchased this bag from this store 2 weeks ago, and I'm simply requesting a return due to a manufacturing defect." Marcus continued his examination of the receipt, making a show of checking watermarks and security features that any actual fraudster would have replicated perfectly. His performance was designed not to verify authenticity, but to create doubt, to make her feel small and dishonest in front of an audience that was growing by the minute. "The problem is," Marcus said, setting the receipt down with deliberate skepticism, "we've had several people trying to return items with suspicious documentation. I'm going to need to verify this with my manager." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The receipt contained all necessary verification codes that could be checked instantly in the computer system. More damaging was the implication that Keisha looked like the type of person who would commit return fraud, that her honesty was automatically suspect, that her word meant less than that of other customers. "Sir," Keisha said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I understand you need to be careful, but this is a legitimate purchase with a valid receipt. The bag has a clear manufacturing defect, and I'm requesting a standard return that should take less than 5 minutes." But Marcus wasn't interested in efficiency or customer satisfaction. He was interested in power, the power to make someone squirm, to assert dominance over someone he perceived as powerless, to demonstrate control in the small kingdom of his customer service counter. "Ma'am," he said, the title dripping with condescension, "I'm going to need you to calm down. Getting agitated isn't going to help your situation." The phrase "calm down" landed like a match on gasoline. Keisha hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made any aggressive gestures, hadn't done anything except state her legitimate request with reasonable firmness. But Marcus was deploying one of the oldest weapons in the arsenal of racial bias, the angry black woman stereotype, designed to paint any assertion of rights or dignity as inappropriate aggression. Around them, the audience was growing. Phone cameras appeared discreetly, recording what was clearly becoming more than a routine customer service interaction. Keisha could feel the weight of their attention, the way some watched with sympathy, while others seemed to enjoy the spectacle of someone being put in their place. "I am perfectly calm," Keisha replied, her voice steady but her eyes flashing with controlled fury. "I'm a customer with a legitimate complaint who deserves to be treated with basic respect." "Respect is earned," Marcus shot back, his mask of professionalism finally slipping enough to reveal the ugliness beneath. "And people who come in here trying to scam the system don't earn much respect from me." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through the gathered crowd and transforming their perception of the interaction. No longer was this a customer service issue. It was a confrontation between an honest employee and a suspected criminal, with Marcus positioned as the heroic defender of company interests. Keisha felt 35 years of progress evaporating in an instant. All her success, all her power, all her carefully constructed empire meant nothing when filtered through the lens of prejudice that saw her skin color before her humanity. She was no longer Keisha Washington, billionaire executive and retail visionary. She was just another black woman whose honesty was questioned, whose dignity was negotiable, whose right to fair treatment was conditional on the whims of someone who had never experienced a moment of her struggle. But the cruelest irony was that this humiliation was happening in her own store, delivered by her own employee, witnessed by customers shopping in the empire she had built with dreams of creating something better. The fire in her chest grew hotter, fueled not just by personal outrage, but by the devastating realization that all her efforts to create an inclusive, respectful environment had failed at the most fundamental level. The values she had tried to instill, the culture she had attempted to build, the dreams she had poured into every hiring decision and training program, all of it crumbled in the face of one man's unconscious bias and abuse of power. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that carried implicit threat. "Maybe you should take your business elsewhere. We don't appreciate customers who cause trouble." And in that moment, Keisha Washington, who had conquered Wall Street and built a $1 billion empire, who had been featured on magazine covers and invited to speak at prestigious conferences, felt the same helpless rage she had experienced as a 17-year-old girl in a prom dress shop 35 years ago. The only difference was that this time, she had the power to ensure it would never happen again, if she was brave enough to use it. The silence that followed Marcus's dismissal stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Keisha stood frozen at the customer service counter, her grandmother's purse clutched in hands that trembled with suppressed fury. Around them, the store's carefully orchestrated atmosphere of luxury and welcome had transformed into something else entirely. A theater where dignity went to die, where prejudice wore the mask of customer service protocol. The growing crowd of onlookers created a circle of judgment, their phones raised like modern-day torches illuminating a public humiliation. Some faces showed sympathy, others displayed the uncomfortable fascination of people watching a car accident unfold. But most troubling were the expressions of those who seemed to accept Marcus's narrative without question, their eyes already categorizing Keisha as the problem customer who deserved whatever treatment she received. "I'm not going anywhere," Keisha said, her voice carrying a steel that made Marcus take an involuntary step back. "I have a legitimate receipt, a legitimate complaint, and a legitimate right to fair treatment in this store." Marcus's jaw tightened, his professional facade cracking further to reveal the ugly truth beneath. "Ma'am, you need to leave immediately, or I'll have to call security." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Security, as if she were a criminal, as if requesting basic customer service constituted some kind of crime worthy of armed intervention. Keisha felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the ghosts of every black person who had been escorted out of stores for the crime of existing while melanin rich. But she also felt something else rising within her, not just anger, but a crystalline clarity born from years of fighting battles in boardrooms where the stakes were measured in millions. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every customer who would walk into this store after her, every person who would face this same choice between dignity and submission. "Call security if you must," she replied, her voice steady as granite. "But I'm not leaving until this situation is resolved properly." From her position near the cosmetics counter, Jessica Liu watched the confrontation with growing alarm. She had worked at Lux & Company for 3 years, long enough to witness dozens of customer service interactions, and something about this felt fundamentally wrong. The woman at the counter carried herself with quiet dignity despite Marcus's increasingly hostile treatment, and her requests seemed perfectly reasonable. Jessica glanced toward the handbag department where David Park was pretending to reorganize merchandise while obviously monitoring the situation. Their eyes met across the store floor, sharing a moment of understanding. They had both noticed troubling patterns in Marcus's behavior over recent months, subtle but consistent differences in how he treated customers based on appearance, accent, or perceived economic status. "Should we do something?" Jessica whispered to Angela Martinez, who had drifted closer under the pretense of restocking nearby displays. Angela's expression was troubled as she watched Marcus lean forward aggressively, his body language designed to intimidate. "I don't know. He's the department manager. What can we do?" The question hung between them, highlighting the complex dynamics of workplace hierarchy and the courage required to challenge authority, even when that authority was clearly wrong. They were good employees, dedicated to the company's stated values, but they were also human beings caught between their consciences and their paychecks. Meanwhile, Marcus was doubling down on his aggressive stance, seemingly energized by what he perceived as his audience's support. "Ma'am, I've been more than patient with you, but you're disrupting our store environment and making other customers uncomfortable." It was a masterful deflection, transforming her victimization into an accusation, making her the cause of discomfort rather than its target. Keisha recognized the tactic from countless business negotiations where opponents tried to make her reasonable requests seem unreasonable through sheer audacity. "The only thing making people uncomfortable," Keisha replied, her voice carrying across the store with unmistakable authority, is watching a customer be treated with such obvious disrespect and discrimination. The word discrimination crackled through the air like electricity, making several onlookers shift uncomfortably. It was the unspoken truth that everyone could sense, but few were willing to name directly. Marcus's face flushed red at the accusation, his carefully maintained professional image crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I treat all customers equally. You're the one making this about race." It was the classic deflection of someone caught in the act, blaming the victim for recognizing their victimization, turning awareness of discrimination into the problem rather than the discrimination itself. But Keisha had heard this song before, in boardrooms and conference rooms where her competence was questioned and her achievements attributed to diversity initiatives rather than merit. "I'm making this about customer service," she corrected, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm making this about basic human dignity. I'm making this about the values this company claims to represent." The mention of company values struck something deep in Jessica Liu's chest. She remembered her first day at Lux & Company, sitting in orientation while a trainer spoke passionately about treating every customer like family, about creating an inclusive environment where everyone felt welcome and respected. Those words had meant something to her, had made her proud to work for a company that seemed to understand what true hospitality looked like. But watching Marcus's behavior now, seeing how he had escalated a simple return into a public humiliation, she felt those values crumbling like sand castles at high tide. "Excuse me," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the tension as she approached the customer service counter. "Is there anything I can help with here?" Marcus whirled on her with barely contained fury. "This doesn't concern you, Jessica. Get back to your department." But Jessica held her ground, her gentle nature finding unexpected steel. "Actually, it does concern me. We're all representatives of this company, and I'd like to understand what's happening." The intervention shifted the dynamic in subtle but important ways. No longer was this simply a confrontation between Marcus and a lone customer. It was becoming a broader question about store culture and employee responsibility. Other staff members began to drift closer, their body language revealing their own discomfort with what they were witnessing. David Park materialized near the counter, his quiet presence adding weight to Jessica's gentle challenge. "Is there a problem with the return?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with concern. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as his authority was questioned by his own colleagues. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, and his response revealed the true depths of his character. "Both of you need to mind your own business," he snapped, his professional mask finally falling away completely. "This customer is being difficult and disruptive, and I'm handling it according to store policy." "What policy is that?" Jessica asked, her voice gaining confidence. "Because I've processed hundreds of returns, and I've never seen a legitimate receipt question this thoroughly." The challenge was gentle but devastating. Jessica's question illuminated the arbitrary nature of Marcus's suspicion. The way his skepticism seemed reserved for certain types of customers while others received automatic trust and courtesy. Keisha watched this unexpected support develop with a mixture of gratitude and heartbreak. These young employees were risking their jobs to stand up for principles that their manager had abandoned, showing more courage and integrity than the person supposedly leading them. But their intervention also highlighted the tragedy of the situation. These were her employees, people she had hired and trained, people who embodied the values she had tried to instill, and they were having to fight against another of her employees to uphold those same values. The irony was devastating. Her own company was at war with itself, and she was standing at the center of the battlefield disguised as a casualty. Marcus, realizing that his authority was being undermined by his own staff, made a decision that would change everything. His face darkened with rage, his professional restraint finally snapping under the pressure of public scrutiny and collegial challenge. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising to a level that commanded attention throughout the store. "I've had enough of this nonsense." And in one swift, shocking motion that no one saw coming, Marcus Thompson raised his hand and brought it down across Keisha Washington's face with a sound that echoed through the store like a gunshot. The slap reverberated through the marble space with devastating finality, followed by a silence so complete that even the store's background music seemed to pause in shock. Phones captured the moment from multiple angles, the violence immortalized in high definition for the world to witness. Keisha stood motionless, her cheek burning with pain and humiliation, her grandmother's purse still clutched in hands that shook with more than anger now. Around her, gasps and cries of outrage erupted from the crowd, but she heard them as if from a great distance. In that moment, standing in the store she had built with dreams of dignity and respect, Keisha Washington felt something break inside her chest. Not just her heart, but her faith in everything she had spent her life trying to create. The test was over. She had her answer, and it was worse than she could have ever imagined. The silence that followed the slap lasted exactly 3 heartbeats, 3 suspended moments where the entire store seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself was processing what had just occurred. Then reality crashed back like a tsunami, bringing with it a cacophony of gasps, shouts, and the frantic clicking of phone cameras capturing what would soon become the most viral video in Lux & Company's history. Keisha touched her burning cheek with trembling fingers, feeling the heat radiating from where Marcus's hand had struck her. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation coursing through her veins. In 35 years of building her empire, through countless battles in boardrooms and hostile takeovers, through discrimination and sexism, and every obstacle the business world could throw at a black woman with audacious dreams, no one had ever laid a hand on her in violence. Until now. Until this moment in her own store, struck by her own employee, in front of customers shopping in the empire she had built with her own blood, sweat, and tears. "Oh my God," Jessica Lou whispered, her face pale with shock. "Marcus, what have you done?" David Park stood frozen, his usually calm demeanor shattered by the incomprehensible violence he had just witnessed. Around them, customers backed away as if the assault were contagious, their expressions ranging from horror to righteous anger to the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a catastrophe. Marcus seemed equally stunned by his own actions, his hand still raised slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had done. But instead of remorse or apology, his face hardened with defiant justification. "She was getting aggressive," he said loudly, playing to the cameras he knew were recording. "I felt threatened. I was defending myself." The lie was so audacious, so completely divorced from the reality that dozens of witnesses had just observed, that several people in the crowd actually gasped. Keisha had never raised her voice above a conversational tone, never made a threatening gesture, never done anything except stand her ground with quiet dignity while being systematically humiliated. But Marcus was doubling down, transforming his unprovoked assault into a story of self-defense, turning himself from aggressor to victim with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to manipulate narratives to his advantage. "That's not what happened," Angela Martinez said, finding her voice despite her fear. "She never threatened you. She was just asking for a return." "Stay out of this, Angela," Marcus snapped, his authority fracturing but his arrogance intact. "You didn't see what I saw." The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity, attempting to convince witnesses that they hadn't seen what they had clearly observed, that their reality was somehow less valid than his manufactured version of events. But Keisha barely heard the escalating argument around her. She stood in the eye of the storm, her mind reeling with implications that went far beyond this single moment of violence. This wasn't just about Marcus Thompson anymore. This was about everything she had built, everything she had believed about her company, everything she had thought she had accomplished. For 28 years, she had told herself that she was different, that her success meant something beyond personal achievement. She had convinced herself that by building a business empire, she could create spaces where others wouldn't have to endure what she had suffered. She had believed that her wealth and influence could translate into real change, that she could use her power to build something better. But standing here with her cheek still burning from an employee's hand, surrounded by the wreckage of that beautiful delusion, she realized how naive she had been. Money couldn't buy character. Success couldn't purchase integrity. All her power meant nothing if the people she trusted to carry her vision were capable of such casual cruelty. The cameras were still recording, capturing every moment for a world that would soon know exactly how Lux and company treated its customers. The viral video would destroy the company's reputation, crater stock prices, and trigger investigations that would expose every failure of leadership and culture that had led to this moment. But even as she recognized the approaching storm, Keisha felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not just anger or humiliation, but a strange sense of liberation. For weeks, she had wondered whether her company truly embodied her values or merely paid lip service to them. Now she knew. The test was complete, the results unambiguous. Her company had failed in the most spectacular way possible, which meant she was finally free to fix it. "Sir," came a new voice from behind the growing crowd, cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "I'm going to need you to step away from the customer." Everyone turned to see Robert Kim approaching from the perfume counter, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by something harder, more determined. Behind him came two more employees, Sarah Collins from accessories and Michael Torres from men's clothing, their faces grim with purpose. "This is none of your business, Robert," Marcus said, but his voice carried less conviction now. The tide was turning against him, his isolation becoming more apparent with each passing moment. "Actually, it is our business," Robert replied, his voice steady despite the obvious risk he was taking. "We all work here. We all represent this company. And what you just did doesn't represent anything I want to be associated with." The moral clarity of Robert's statement cut through the confusion like a blade. Here was an employee willing to risk his job to stand up for principles that his manager had abandoned, showing the kind of courage and integrity that Keisha had hoped to instill throughout her organization. But the irony wasn't lost on her. The values she had tried to build into her company were being defended by frontline employees against the very manager she had trusted to uphold them. "I want all of you to get back to work," Marcus commanded, his voice rising with desperation. "This is a customer service issue, and I'm handling it according to company policy." "What policy?" Sarah Collins asked, her voice cutting through his bluster. "Show me the policy that says you can hit customers." The question hung in the air like an exposed live wire. There was, of course, no such policy. Marcus had acted entirely outside any conceivable guideline or procedure, his assault a pure expression of personal bias and unchecked anger. Keisha watched this rebellion unfold with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. These employees, her employees, were showing the kind of moral courage that she had hoped to inspire when she built this company. They were risking their livelihoods to defend a stranger, standing up for principles that transcended paychecks and job security. But they were having to stand up against another of her employees, someone she had hired and trusted, someone whose behavior reflected her failures as a leader and judge of character. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just Marcus's failure, it was hers. She had created the system that allowed this to happen, hired the person who made it inevitable, failed to build the safeguards that might have prevented it. As the crowd of supporters grew around her and the cameras continued recording what would soon become a worldwide symbol of corporate failure, Keisha Washington made a decision that would change everything. She reached into her grandmother's purse and pulled out her phone, not the simple device she had carried as part of her disguise, but her real phone, the one that connected her to a world of power and influence beyond most people's imagination. With steady fingers, she scrolled to a contact that would transform this moment from a customer service disaster into something much larger and more consequential. "Ms. Washington?" came the familiar voice of her head of security. "Is everything all right? You're not supposed to be checking in until this afternoon." Around her, the argument continued to escalate, Marcus growing more belligerent as his authority crumbled, the supporting employees standing firmer in their moral stance. But Keisha barely heard them anymore. "James," she said quietly into the phone, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need you to come to the Fifth Avenue flagship store immediately." Bring legal, bring HR, and bring the emergency response team. Ma'am, what's the situation? Keisha looked around at the chaos surrounding her. The employees defending principles their manager had abandoned. The customers recording what would soon be evidence in a corporate catastrophe. The man who had just committed assault in her own store while wearing her company's uniform. The situation, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word, is that I just discovered exactly what kind of company I've been running. And it's about to change. As she ended the call, Keisha felt the weight of her disguise falling away like shed skin. Soon, everyone in this store would know exactly who she was. Soon, Marcus Thompson would discover that he hadn't just assaulted a random customer. He had struck the person who owned everything he could see. Soon, the real test would begin. Not a test of her company's values, but a test of her own courage to burn down everything she had built in order to create something worthy of the dreams that had started it all. The young employees still stood around her in protective formation, their faces showing the kind of character she had always hoped to inspire. Marcus continued his defensive rant, unaware that his world was about to collapse completely. And in the distance, barely audible over the commotion, came the sound of approaching sirens, both metaphorical and literal, carrying the promise that this moment would be remembered as either the end of everything Keisha Washington had worked for, or the beginning of something infinitely better. What do you think it takes for a leader to completely rebuild their company from the ground up? Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's true character was revealed under pressure? Share your thoughts below. I'm curious whether you think some organizations can be saved, or if they need to be completely torn down and rebuilt. The 15 minutes that followed felt like 15 hours. Keisha stood in the center of her store surrounded by chaos that seemed to multiply with each passing moment, watching her carefully constructed world crumble in real time. The videos were already spreading across social media platforms like wildfire, each share and repost carrying her company's reputation further into the abyss. She could see it happening on the phones around her, customers and employees alike frantically posting, texting, calling friends to share what they had witnessed. The hashtags were already forming. Hashtag Lux and Co-assault, hashtag retail racism, hashtag customer abuse. Each viral share felt like another nail in the coffin of everything she had spent 28 years building. Marcus had barricaded himself behind the customer service counter, his bravado cracking as the magnitude of his actions began to penetrate his defenses. He was no longer the aggressive manager throwing around accusations and threats. Now he looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between the crowd of witnesses and the phones capturing his every movement. "This is all being blown out of proportion," he kept saying, his voice growing more desperate with each repetition. She was aggressive. I felt threatened. I was defending myself and the other customers. But his narrative was falling apart faster than he could construct it. Too many people had witnessed the truth, recorded the reality, captured the unprovoked nature of his assault. His lies were being exposed in real time by an audience that had seen everything. Jessica Liu approached Keisha tentatively, her young face etched with concern and confusion. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical attention? Should we call the police?" The irony of the question struck Keisha like another slap. Here was an employee showing more care and professionalism in the aftermath of violence than her manager had shown during what should have been a routine customer service interaction. Jessica embodied everything Keisha had tried to build into her company culture, while Marcus represented everything she had tried to keep out. "I'm fine," Keisha said softly, though she was anything but fine. Her cheeks still throbbed where Marcus had struck her, but the physical pain was negligible compared to the emotional devastation of seeing her life's work reduced to a viral video of corporate brutality. Through the store's massive windows, she could see news vans beginning to gather on the street outside. Someone had recognized the significance of what was happening, understood that this wasn't just another customer service dispute, but a potential corporate catastrophe in the making. The media vultures were circling, drawn by the scent of a billion-dollar company's public relations nightmare. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages. Her assistant, her board members, her PR team, all desperately trying to reach her as crisis management protocols activated across her empire. But she couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she tell them? That their CEO had just been assaulted by one of her own employees while conducting an undercover test? That the company's carefully cultivated image of inclusivity and respect had been revealed as a hollow lie? David Park materialized beside her with a chair from a nearby display area. "Please sit down," he said gently. "You've been through something traumatic." His kindness almost broke her. Here were her frontline employees, people making a fraction of what Marcus earned, people with no real power or authority in the corporate hierarchy, showing more leadership and humanity than the person she had trusted to manage an entire department. As she sank into the chair, Keisha felt the full weight of her failure settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about hiring the wrong person or failing to catch warning signs in Marcus's behavior. This was about the systematic failure of everything she had tried to create. How many other customers had Marcus treated with similar disrespect? How many had left her stores feeling humiliated and diminished, never to return? How many had endured microaggressions and bias while she sat in her executive suite, insulated from the reality of what was happening on her own sales floor? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each one revealing new depths of her ignorance and complicity. She had built a billion-dollar empire while remaining fundamentally disconnected from the experiences of the people that empire was supposed to serve. Angela Martinez knelt beside her chair, her voice low and urgent. "The manager of the whole store just arrived," she whispered. "Linda Morrison. She's asking what happened, and Marcus is giving her his version of events." Keisha looked across the store to see Linda Morrison, a woman she had hired personally 3 years ago, someone whose resume and interviews had impressed her with their commitment to customer service excellence. Linda stood near the customer service counter listening to Marcus's animated explanation, her face grave with concentration. But even from a distance, Keisha could see the doubt in Linda's expression, the way her eyes kept moving to the crowd of witnesses, and the phone still recording everything. Linda was smart enough to recognize a public relations disaster when she saw one, experienced enough to know that the truth was rarely found in the most defensive narrative. "Ma'am," Linda said, approaching with cautious professionalism. "I'm Linda Morrison, the store manager. I understand there's been an incident, and I want to assure you that we take these situations very seriously." The words were correct, measured, exactly what any crisis management manual would recommend. But they felt hollow to Keisha, corporate speak designed to minimize liability rather than address injustice. How many times had she heard similar phrases from other companies when they faced public scandals? How many times had she critiqued their empty responses while believing her own company would handle things differently? "What exactly are you going to do about this?" Jessica Liu asked, her voice carrying an edge of challenge that surprised everyone, including herself. "Your customer service manager just assaulted a customer for trying to return a defective product. What's your response to that?" Linda's professional composure flickered slightly at the direct challenge from a subordinate. "We're still gathering information about what happened," she replied carefully. "We need to hear all perspectives before drawing any conclusions." "All perspectives?" David Park stepped forward, his quiet demeanor replaced by something harder. "We all saw what happened. There's video evidence. What other perspectives do you need?" The question exposed the fundamental problem with corporate crisis management, the instinct to treat obvious injustice as if it were a complex puzzle requiring careful analysis. The desire to find middle ground where none existed, to balance competing narratives when one was clearly true and the other was demonstrably false. Keisha watched this exchange with growing horror, not because of what it revealed about Linda Morrison, but because of what it revealed about the culture she had created. Even her store manager, someone she had chosen and trained, was more concerned with protecting the company than protecting the customer who had been assaulted. The systemic nature of the failure was becoming undeniable. This wasn't just about Marcus Thompson or even about inadequate hiring practices. This was about a culture that prioritized corporate interests over human dignity, that treated customers as potential threats rather than valued partners, that allowed bias and prejudice to flourish as long as they were expressed with professional politeness. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her head of legal affairs. Emergency board meeting called for 6 p.m. Stock down 12% in after-hours trading. Need immediate response strategy. 12%. In less than an hour, her company had lost over $300 million in market value because one employee couldn't treat a customer with basic respect. The financial implications were staggering, but they paled in comparison to the human cost. Not just her own humiliation, but the message this incident sent to every black customer who might consider shopping in her stores. Through the windows, she could see the crowd of reporters growing larger, their cameras and microphones ready to capture whatever statement would emerge from this crisis. Soon, she would have to face them, would have to explain how the company she had built on dreams of dignity and inclusion had become the setting for such a spectacular failure of those very values. But first, she had to figure out what she was going to say. How do you apologize for betraying everything you claim to stand for? How do you rebuild trust that has been shattered so completely? How do you convince the world that you're different when the evidence suggests you're exactly the same as every other corporation that prioritizes profits over people? Ma'am, Linda Morrison continued, her voice taking on a slightly impatient edge. I understand you're upset, but we need to discuss how to resolve this situation. Perhaps we could speak privately in my office. The suggestion felt like another assault, an attempt to move the conversation away from witnesses and cameras, to control the narrative and minimize the damage. It was exactly what Keisha would have expected from a company trying to protect itself rather than serve justice. But she was no longer just a customer seeking fair treatment. She was the owner of this entire disaster, the person ultimately responsible for every failure of culture and character that had led to this moment. And she was about to teach everyone in this store, employees, customers, and media alike, what real accountability looked like. The time for disguises and tests was over. The time for truth had arrived. Even if that truth destroyed everything she had spent her life building. Keisha Washington rose from the chair with the slow, deliberate movement of someone about to change the course of history. Around her, the chaos continued. Marcus still defending his actions, Linda Morrison trying to manage an impossible situation, employees and customers watching the slow-motion collapse of what should have been a routine business day. But something fundamental had shifted in Keisha's bearing, a transformation visible to anyone who understood the subtle languages of power. The hunched shoulders of a victim were replaced by the straight spine of an executive. The trembling hands of someone who had been assaulted steadied into the controlled gestures of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. She reached into her grandmother's purse one final time, withdrawing not just her real phone, but her corporate credit card, the black titanium rectangle that bore her name, and the kind of spending limit that most people couldn't imagine. She held it between her fingers like a talisman, feeling its weight as both promise and burden. "Linda," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with quiet authority that made conversations pause mid-sentence. "I need you to step away from Mr. Thompson for a moment." There was something in her tone, a note of command that transcended the customer-employee dynamic, that made Linda Morrison stop mid-sentence and turn with sharp attention. Her experienced eye caught the change in posture, the shift in energy that suggested this was no ordinary customer with an ordinary complaint. "Ma'am," Linda replied, uncertainty creeping into her professional composure. Keisha looked around the store, her store, taking in the faces of employees who had shown courage, customers who had borne witness, and cameras that had captured every moment of her company's moral failure. Then she looked at Marcus Thompson, still barricaded behind the customer service counter, still spinning his web of justifications and lies. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying across the store with crystalline clarity. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus looked up from his defensive posture, irritation flashing across his features. "Lady, I don't care who you are. You were causing trouble, and I handled the situation." The answer hung in the air like a challenge, revealing the depth of his arrogance and the completeness of his disconnect from reality. Here was a man so certain of his own righteousness, so convinced of his authority, that he couldn't imagine any consequences for his actions. Keisha smiled, not with warmth or amusement, but with the cold satisfaction of someone about to deliver justice with surgical precision. "My name," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is Keisha Washington. I am the founder, CEO, and majority owner of Lux & Company. This building belongs to me. This company belongs to me. And you, Mr. Thompson, work for me." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the shocked silence of the moments after the slap, but the profound quiet of a universe reorganizing itself around a new reality. Every person in the store, employees, customers, security guards, even the reporters pressing against the windows, froze as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. Marcus Thompson's face went through a series of expressions so rapid they seemed like stop-motion photography. Confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, the blood-draining terror of someone who had just realized they had committed career suicide in the most public way possible. That's not possible," he stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. He was looking at her with new eyes now, seeing past the discount clothes and worn purse to the bearing and authority that no disguise could fully hide. "Jessica," Keisha said, turning to the young woman who had shown such courage throughout the ordeal, "would you mind retrieving my identification from the manager's office? Linda has a file with my photo and corporate information. I believe it's time everyone here understood exactly what has transpired today." Jessica Liu stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process the transformation she was witnessing. The customer she had been trying to protect was revealing herself to be the person who signed her paychecks, the visionary leader she had admired from afar, the woman whose inspiring story had attracted her to work for Lux & Company in the first place. "Ms. Washington?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's really you?" "It's really me," Keisha confirmed, her tone gentling slightly for the young woman who had risked her job to defend a stranger's dignity. "And I want you to know that what you did today, standing up for what's right when it would have been easier to stay silent, that's exactly the kind of character this company needs more of." David Park stepped forward, his quiet demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. "You were testing us. This whole thing was a test." "It was," Keisha confirmed, her gaze sweeping across the gathered employees. "I needed to know whether the values I thought I had built into this company actually existed beyond mission statements and training manuals. I needed to understand how my customers were really being treated when I wasn't watching." She turned back to Marcus, who had gone pale as paper, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "And you, Mr. Thompson, have provided me with the most comprehensive answer imaginable." Linda Morrison found her voice, though it trembled with the recognition of her own precarious position. "Ms. Washington, I had no idea. If I had known, if you had known who I was, you would have treated this situation differently?" Keisha's question was sharp as a blade. "The problem, Linda, is that your response should have been the same regardless of my identity. Every customer who walks through these doors deserves the same respect, the same dignity, the same protection from harassment and abuse." The corporate hierarchy was crumbling in real time, assumptions about power and authority being stripped away to reveal the human dynamics underneath. The customers who had witnessed the assault were realizing they had seen something historic, not just a viral moment, but the exposure of systemic problems in one of America's most successful retail companies. "I built this company," Keisha continued, her voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word, "because I believed that business could be a force for good. I believed that success didn't have to come at the expense of human dignity. I believed that we could create spaces where every person, regardless of their skin color, their accent, their clothing, or their bank account, would be treated with respect." She gestured around the store, taking in the carefully curated displays, the elegant fixtures, the mission statement etched in gold near the entrance. "But I was wrong. Not about the possibility of creating such a place, but about thinking I had already succeeded in building it. Marcus Thompson made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Ms. Washington, I didn't know. I mean, if I had realized. Stop. The single word carried such authority that Marcus's mouth snapped shut instantly. Don't make this worse by suggesting that my identity changes the nature of what you did. You didn't assault a stranger. You assaulted the person who trusted you to represent her values, who believed in your potential, who gave you the opportunity to build something meaningful. She pulled out her phone again, but this time she placed it on the customer service counter for everyone to see. I'm calling an emergency meeting of the board of directors, the executive team, and the heads of all departments. We're going to review every policy, every training program, every hiring practice, and every cultural norm in this company. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about firing Marcus Thompson or issuing an apology. This was about dismantling and rebuilding an entire corporate culture, about admitting that success measured only in profits was actually failure measured in human terms. But first, she said, her eyes locking onto Marcus with laser intensity, we're going to address the immediate situation. Mr. Thompson, you are terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you will never again represent this company in any capacity. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. What could he say? He had been caught on camera assaulting the owner of the company, had been witnessed by dozens of people, had destroyed his own career with his own hands. Linda, Keisha continued, turning to the store manager, you have a choice to make. You can be part of the solution, or you can be part of the problem. But you cannot be both. The moment crystallized around them like a work of art. The transformation of a victim into an agent of change, the exposure of systemic failure, the promise of redemption through honest reckoning. The cameras were still rolling, still capturing every word for a world that was about to witness what real accountability looked like. But more than that, they were documenting the birth of something new, not just a company committed to its stated values, but a leader who had been tested by fire and emerged with the courage to burn down everything she had built in order to create something worthy of her dreams. The turning point had arrived, and Keisha Washington was ready to turn. The transformation in the store's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Word of Keisha's identity spread through the space like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and urgent text messages. Employees who had been watching from the periphery now gathered closer, their faces showing mixtures of awe, concern, and anticipation. They were witnessing history, not just the exposure of a problematic manager, but the potential rebirth of their entire company. James Rodriguez, Keisha's head of security, arrived with his team just as the revelation was reaching its full impact. A former Marine with 20 years of corporate protection experience, James had seen his share of crisis situations, but the scene that greeted him was unlike anything in his professional experience. His boss, the woman he was paid to protect, stood in the center of a crowd, her cheeks still bearing the mark of an assault, surrounded by cameras and reporters who were documenting what would become one of the most watched corporate accountability moments in recent history. Ms. Washington, James said, approaching with careful professionalism despite his obvious concern. We received your call. What's the situation? Keisha gestured toward Marcus Thompson, who stood behind the customer service counter like a man awaiting execution. Mr. Rodriguez, please escort Mr. Thompson from the building. He's no longer employed here, and I want him removed immediately. James's trained I took in the scene, the phone still recording, the gathered crowd, the obvious tension crackling through the air. He had protected CEOs through hostile takeovers and shareholder revolts, but this felt different, more personal, more consequential. Copy that, he said, then signaled to his team. Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Thompson out. Professional and discreet. As security moved toward Marcus, he finally seemed to grasp the full magnitude of his situation. Please, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. Ms. Washington, I made a mistake. I didn't know who you were. Can't we work this out? Keisha's expression didn't soften. Mr. Thompson, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you believed who I appeared to be gave you the right to treat me with disrespect and violence. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." She turned to address the growing crowd of employees and customers, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and conference centers. "What happened here today was unacceptable. Not just the assault, but everything that led up to it. The assumptions, the bias, the systematic dehumanization of a customer who deserved better." Linda Morrison stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Ms. Washington, I take full responsibility for what happened in my store. If you're looking for someone to blame—" "I'm not looking for someone to blame, Linda," Keisha interrupted. "I'm looking for people who are ready to be part of the solution. The question is, are you one of them?" The challenge hung in the air like a test, another test, but this one offered redemption rather than exposure. Linda Morrison had spent 3 years building her career at Lux & Company, and now she faced a choice that would define not just her professional future, but her personal integrity. "Yes," Linda said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I want to be part of the solution. Tell me what you need." Keisha nodded approvingly, then turned to Jessica Liu, David Park, and the other employees who had shown courage during the crisis. "I want each of you to think about what you witnessed today. Not just the assault, but the culture that allowed it to happen. I want you to think about other incidents you've seen, other moments when customers were treated unfairly, other times when you wanted to speak up but didn't feel empowered to do so." Angela Martinez raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Washington, are we going to get in trouble for speaking honestly?" "Quite the opposite," Keisha replied firmly. "You're going to be rewarded for it. Starting today, this company operates on radical honesty. If you see something wrong, you report it. If you witness discrimination, you document it. If you have ideas for improvement, you share them. And you do all of this without fear of retaliation." She pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, then handed it to James. "I want you to record what I'm about to say. This statement will go to every employee, every customer, every stakeholder, and every media outlet that covers this company." James positioned the phone while Keisha composed herself, drawing on decades of experience delivering high-stakes presentations to audiences that could make or break her business. "My name is Keisha Washington," she began, looking directly into the camera with unflinching honesty. "I am the founder and CEO of Lux & Company, and today I witnessed firsthand the failure of everything I thought I had built into this company." She paused, allowing the weight of that admission to settle before continuing. "A customer, someone who deserved our respect and attention, was assaulted by one of my employees for no reason other than his unconscious bias and abuse of power. This is unacceptable. This is not who we are. This is not who we will ever be again." The crowd around her had grown silent, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. A CEO taking full accountability for corporate failure without lawyers or PR consultants to soften the message. Effective immediately, Lux & Company will implement the most comprehensive bias training, cultural sensitivity, and customer service excellence program in the retail industry, she continued. "We will audit every policy, review every hiring practice, and rebuild every system that allowed today's incident to occur." She gestured toward the employees who had shown courage during the crisis. These team members, Jessica Liu, David Park, Angela Martinez, Robert Kim, Sarah Collins, Michael Torres, will form our new Customer Dignity Council, reporting directly to me. They will have the authority to investigate complaints, recommend changes, and ensure that every customer who enters our stores is treated with the respect they deserve. The announcement sent ripples of surprise and excitement through the gathered employees. This wasn't just corporate damage control. This was fundamental organizational change, the kind of transformation that most companies talked about, but few actually implemented. "But most importantly," Keisha continued, her voice growing more passionate, "we will never again tolerate discrimination, bias, or violence against our customers. Any employee who cannot commit to treating every human being with dignity will find employment elsewhere." She turned back to Linda Morrison. "Linda, I want you to personally review every customer complaint from the past year. Look for patterns, identify problems, and bring me recommendations for systemic improvements. You have unlimited resources and my complete authority to make whatever changes are necessary." Linda nodded eagerly, recognizing the opportunity for redemption and meaningful impact. "Yes, ma'am. When do you want the report?" 2 weeks, Keisha replied. "And I want it to be thorough. If there are other employees who share Mr. Thompson's attitudes, I want to know about them. If there are policies that enable discrimination, I want them changed. If there are training gaps that allow bias to flourish, I want them filled." She looked around the store one final time, taking in the faces of employees who would carry her renewed vision forward and customers who had witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in corporate accountability. This company was built on a dream of creating spaces where everyone feels welcome, valued, and respected, she said, her voice carrying the passion that had driven her from poverty to prosperity. Today, we learned that dream had become a delusion. But dreams, when they're built on truth rather than wishful thinking, can be reborn stronger than ever. The cameras were still rolling, still capturing every word for a world that was hungry for authentic leadership and genuine accountability. But more importantly, they were documenting a promise, not just from a CEO to her stakeholders, but from a human being who had been tested by fire and emerged with unshakable determination to create something worthy of her highest values. As James ended the recording and security finished escorting Marcus Thompson from the building, Keisha felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The electric thrill of starting over, of building something new from the ashes of something that had proven unworthy of its own aspirations. The test was complete. The reckoning had begun. And Keisha Washington was ready to prove that sometimes the best response to failure is not denial or deflection, but the courage to tear everything down and build it back better than before. 6 months later, Keisha Washington stood in the same spot where Marcus Thompson had struck her, but the store around her had been transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The physical space looked similar, the same marble floors, the same elegant displays, the same carefully curated atmosphere of luxury and welcome. But the energy was completely different, charged with an authenticity that hadn't existed before. The Customer Dignity Council had become more than just a crisis response measure. It had evolved into the beating heart of Lux & Company's new culture. Jessica Liu, now promoted to Director of Customer Experience, moved through the store with confident purpose, her gentle manner enhanced by the authority to make real changes when problems arose. David Park had become the training coordinator, developing programs that taught not just customer service techniques, but genuine empathy and cultural awareness. Ms. Washington, Jessica approached with a tablet showing the morning's metrics. The customer satisfaction scores from yesterday's mystery shoppers are in. We're at 98.7% positive ratings, with specific praise for how staff handled difficult situations. Keisha smiled, remembering her own mystery shopping experience that had nearly destroyed everything she'd built. Now, the program was conducted by a third-party firm with diverse shoppers who tested not just service quality, but equity and inclusion in treatment. Any areas for improvement? Keisha asked, because she had learned that perfection was less important than the commitment to continuous growth. The new hire in accessories needs more training on our inclusive sizing consultation process, Jessica replied. Angela Martinez is working with her this afternoon. Angela had become something of a legend within the company, the young woman who had found her voice during the crisis and never lost it. She now led the mentorship program that paired experienced employees with newcomers, ensuring that company values were transmitted through relationship rather than just policy manuals. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. The viral video of Marcus's assault had triggered a media firestorm that lasted for weeks, with critics and supporters weighing in on everything from corporate responsibility to racial bias in retail. Stock prices had plummeted initially, wiping out billions in market value as investors worried about lawsuits, boycotts, and regulatory scrutiny. But something remarkable had happened as Keisha followed through on her promises with unprecedented transparency and investment. Customers began returning, not just returning, but bringing friends and family to experience what they called the new Lux and Company. Sales in the flagship store had increased by 40% as word spread about a company that had actually changed rather than just apologized. The most meaningful transformation, however, was in the employees themselves. Linda Morrison had not only survived the crisis but thrived, becoming a passionate advocate for the cultural changes that had initially terrified her. Her comprehensive review had uncovered patterns of subtle discrimination that had been invisible to management but painfully obvious to those who experienced them. "The afternoon shift is here," Linda announced, approaching with her usual professional competence now enhanced by genuine warmth. "Robert Kim is training the new fragrance consultant, and Michael Torres is leading the quarterly bias awareness session for the management team." These sessions had become mandatory for all employees, from entry-level associates to executive leadership. They weren't just corporate box-checking exercises, but honest examinations of unconscious bias, privilege, and the ongoing work required to create truly inclusive environments. Keisha walked through the store, greeting employees who no longer saw her as an untouchable executive, but as someone who had been tested alongside them and emerged committed to their shared values. The hierarchy still existed, businesses needed structure to function, but it was tempered by mutual respect and the understanding that everyone's dignity mattered equally. Near the customer service counter, she paused to watch Sarah Collins helping an elderly Hispanic woman navigate a complex return. Sarah's patience was evident, her Spanish fluent and respectful, her manner demonstrating that customer service was about serving humans, not processing transactions. The interaction reminded Keisha of her own experience 6 months earlier, but in reverse. Instead of suspicion and hostility, she witnessed compassion and competence. Instead of a customer being made to feel small and unwelcome, she saw someone being treated with the dignity that should be standard in any civilized interaction. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Maya. Yes, she had reconnected with Maya, using the vulnerability of her own humiliation as a bridge to understanding her daughter's earlier criticisms about losing touch with her humanity. They spoke regularly now, and Maya had even agreed to join the company's board as an advocate for social responsibility. "Saw the quarterly report," Maya's text read. "Mom, I'm proud of you. This is what I always hoped you could become." The quarterly report told a story that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Despite the initial crisis, Lux & Company had emerged stronger than ever. Customer loyalty had reached all-time highs. Employee retention had improved dramatically. The company's stock price had not only recovered but exceeded previous highs as investors recognized the value of authentic corporate transformation. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most to Keisha. What mattered was the 17-year-old girl who had walked into her store yesterday. A young black woman wearing clothes from a discount chain, carrying a purse that had seen better days, looking for a dress for her senior prom. Keisha had watched from across the store as Jessica Liu approached the teenager with genuine warmth, as David Park helped her find options within her budget, as Angela Martinez offered styling advice that made the girl feel beautiful rather than inadequate. She had watched the transformation on the teenager's face as she realized she was welcome, valued, and respected in a space that treated her dreams as worthy of attention and care. That was the real measure of success, not profits or stock prices, but the knowledge that her stores had become what she had always intended them to be. Spaces where every person could experience dignity, respect, and the possibility that their dreams mattered. The evening sun streamed through the store's massive windows, casting golden light across the marble floors where so much had changed. Customers moved through the space with easy comfort, employees worked with visible pride, and the mission statement near the entrance, the same words that had been there before, now carried the weight of lived truth rather than aspirational rhetoric. "Ms. Washington?" came a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see Jessica Liu approaching with a young man in tow, tall, black, probably in his early 20s, wearing clothes that suggested he was making a special effort to look professional. "This is Marcus Johnson," Jessica said, using a name that made Keisha's heart skip a beat before she realized it was just coincidence. He's interviewing for the customer service position. Keisha extended her hand to the young man, noting the firm handshake and direct eye contact that suggested both confidence and respect. "Mr. Johnson, what interests you about working at Lux & Company?" "Honestly, ma'am," he replied, "I heard about what happened here 6 months ago. I heard about how you handled it, not just firing the guy who messed up, but actually changing the whole company. I want to work somewhere that takes this stuff seriously, where I can make a difference." The answer was perfect, not because it was what she wanted to hear, but because it demonstrated that the company's transformation had become part of its reputation, attracting people who shared its values rather than just those seeking employment. "Jessica," Keisha said, "please make sure Mr. Johnson gets the full interview process. And if he joins our team, I want him to go through the Customer Dignity Council orientation personally." As the young man left with Jessica to continue his interview process, Keisha felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication, and everything to do with growth and redemption. She had been tested in the most brutal way possible, had seen her life's work reduced to a viral video of corporate failure, had faced the choice between defensive denial and courageous transformation. She had chosen transformation, and it had transformed not just her company but herself. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded her of hope and new beginnings. In a few hours, she would go home to the penthouse that had once felt like a fortress protecting her from the world's cruelties. But she no longer needed that protection, because she had learned something more valuable than wealth or power or prestige. She had learned that true strength came not from being invulnerable to injustice, but from having the courage to transform injustice into something better. Not from avoiding pain, but from using pain as fuel for positive change. Not from building walls to keep the world out, but from opening doors to let healing in. As she prepared to leave the store, her store, but also everyone's store now, Keisha Washington smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had faced her greatest test and discovered that sometimes losing everything was the only way to find out what really mattered. The damaged handbag that had started it all sat in a frame in her office now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the most important changes often began with the smallest acts of courage. Next to it was a photo from the previous week's company picnic, dozens of employees and their families, faces shining with genuine happiness and pride in their workplace. But the most treasured item on her desk was a handwritten note from a customer, the elderly Hispanic woman she had watched Sarah Collins serve with such grace. It read simply, "Thank you for creating a place where my granddaughter feels welcome. This is what the world should be like." What do you believe it takes for people to truly change after facing their failures? Have you ever seen someone or an organization completely transform themselves for the better? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about whether real change is possible when people are genuinely committed to growth. That, Keisha thought as she read the note for the 100th time, was exactly what the world should be like. And now, in at least one corner of it, it was, "Thank you for following Keisha's journey from devastating failure to transformative success." Stories like this remind us that our greatest challenges often become our greatest opportunities for growth. What lessons will you take from her experience into your own life and work?